Hey, welcome back to 65 Drums. My name's Justin. So recently, Drumtec just released a bunch of brand new drum triggers. And by brand new, I actually mean all new. Because while they've been making acoustic-sized electronic drums for many years at this point, they've never taken the next step to sell the triggers separately in addition to their main drum line. But now they've finally decided to do that with the Drumtec Groove Bar and the Drumtec Groove Dot. There's also several variations of each. We'll get into all that stuff and whether or not I think these are worth buying. And of course, standard disclaimer, I was given these triggers and mesh heads in order to make videos about them, but this is not a sponsored video or anything like that. It's a legit review with pros and cons. Today's video is brought to you by edrumcenter.com. They've got a great selection of the best brands out there. They've got the knowledge to back it up if you have any questions. They can even make a custom drum set just for you. If any of that sounds interesting, I've got a link to them down in the description below that will save you $25 off your next order. Okay, I'm going to kick off the review first by talking about the more expensive option, which is the Drumtec Groove Bar. And I should probably lead with this. Drumtec is making standalone drum triggers that they're selling separately, but they're still holding back a little bit because the absolute most bleeding edge trigger they make is still only available in their like $7,000 drum set that they just dropped, which looks really, really interesting. Hopefully, I'll get a chance to play that someday. It looks like they're finally offering their drums in a US-based drum store, so that's also very interesting. But of course, that's a video for another day. This is the Drumtec Groove Bar. Let's run over like the basics of what you get in the box. Each trigger can expand and contract. There's several different sizes, short, long, and then a snare drum version that gives you an extra set of brackets in the box, or at least mine did. But they're all pretty much the same. They're all dual zone. Pretty much everything you see here is made out of metal, except for this plastic shell that holds the input jack. The input jack is actually 1/8 inch, so you're not going to connect your cable directly to this. Instead, there's a little middleman cable, this adapter, that goes from 1/8 inch over to 1/4 inch. And the other end sits on the outside of your shell, clipped in place with a little piece of plastic they include in the box. This is narrow enough that it goes right through your air vent. You don't have to modify your shell or cut a hole in your bottom resonant head if you don't want to. Drumtec isn't the only company that does this. Other trigger companies do this, and it has the added benefit of not putting any strain on the trigger itself because you're connecting to an adapter cable. Depending on which size you get, you can go through a different range of drum shells. And the way they do this is smarter than some other implementations I've seen. For example, an older trigger that I tried in the past, it had like a scissor-like design, so while you could expand it and contract it, the thumb screw that was in the middle, if it got loose, the whole thing would bend inward in like a V shape, and that meant that it would lose contact with the drum head if it got loose. Drumtec's design doesn't do that. Instead, if you loosen up this, you can see that it's got more of like a sliding mechanism like that. You can decide where the hot spot of the trigger is. If you have positional sensing as a capability of your drum module, leave it in the center. And if you want to move the hot spot off to the side because you don't need to protect the ability to get positional sensing, you can sort of adjust it like that. It's even really useful when you're doing the initial install, because if you're trying to use a screwdriver and this center of the trigger is in the way, you can slide it out of the way, tighten up some screws on the shell, and then move it back into place. Now, as far as I can tell, the Groove Dot and the Groove Bar both use the exact same kind of foam, which I believe is pretty high quality, but this one uses a foam cone versus a foam rod, which is what the cheaper trigger uses. And from my research, from what I can tell, drum companies, they prefer to use foam cones because they get slightly better response. I don't think it's like it'll give you twice as good triggering, but there appears to be at least some sort of benefit, which is why if you open up any expensive electronic drum pad, they're always using trigger cones, so that gives this a slight edge. Now, when it comes to module setup, because of course you'll need to mess with the settings to get it acting just right, I was very impressed at how close it was out of the box without me having to adjust anything. If you buy enough drum triggers, you'll understand what I'm talking about when I say that some triggers, you have to fight them to force them to work with your drum modules. And then others are kind of just, I don't know, they just work. But of course, that doesn't mean these triggers are perfect. So now let's move ahead to a couple of downsides I've noticed when using these triggers. The first and biggest problem for me, because I live in the US and maybe they use different size screws over here inside of the drums. But with this trigger, it would not fit in my kick drum or any of my toms because they were using screws that didn't fit through the bracket. I took this over to my hardware store to see exactly how big this opening was. It looks like any screws that are M5 or larger do not fit with these. so that was kind of frustrating. That's why I had to just put all the triggers inside of my snare drum because it used smaller screws, so I was kind of forced to put all the triggers there so I could test them for this video. So this can be easily fixed if Drumtec just releases a mid-gen refresh of the triggers that have a slightly wider bracket. It's not like this is welded to it. They can easily just change out the brackets they ship the drum triggers with, but it's something they probably need to do when knowing they're going to ship these out to international customers. Okay, so that's enough about the bar trigger. I really like the Drumtec Groove bar. I think it's worth buying. A little bit pricey, but you do get what you pay for, and it's really easy to use. Now let's move ahead and talk about the Drumtec Groove Dot. This one is much cheaper at 90 euros to 100 euros, depending on if you want to buy the single zone or the dual zone version. Be careful though, because they don't even say single zone or dual zone on the trigger itself. Instead, there's like a serial number, and the only physical difference is that the bracket on the single zone version was a little bit longer than the dual zone version. Maybe to make it better for using inside of kick drums, which is where they probably anticipate that you use it. I couldn't test it with my kick drum because the bracket was too narrow, but that's probably where I would have tried to place it if I was able to do so. As you can probably tell just by looking at these, they're completely different from the Groove Bar in pretty much every way. The piezos are smaller than the piezos on the bar trigger. The foam is the same, but it's a barrel design instead of a cone design. And this is a side-mounted trigger that, number one, eliminates hot spotting because you're never playing exactly on the trigger because you're probably going to put it facing you and you're never accidentally hitting that. But you do lose some of that sensitivity on the far end of the drum. If you have a center trigger in a 14-inch shell and you go from one side to the other side, you're never farther away than 7 inches from the sensor. But with a side-mounted trigger on the same drum, you can be up to 14 inches away from it, which means you won't get the same sensitivity range, even if the piezos and the foam and everything else was equal. So obviously that example is a little bit over the top because you're not going to play with your fingers on a drum. It's just to show you the theoretical sensitivity loss as you go across the drum. When you're playing with sticks, it's not going to drop any hits across the different parts of the drum like that. The only way to get around this sort of trade-off between a center-mounted trigger and a side-mounted trigger is just to use a lot of side-mounted triggers or a lot of center-mounted triggers, or both. So at the end of the day, ideally, I would just buy a whole set of the bar triggers because there were, few hiccups and I just loved how they worked and I really, really enjoyed using them. But when it comes to the side-mounted triggers, they also work as well. And if you want to compromise in order to save some money and also get the bar trigger, you get the bar trigger just for the snare drum and then side-mounted triggers for everything else. And that gives you the best of both worlds. But of course, do your own thing. This is just a review, one guy with one module. I'm not trying to pretend this was scientific or anything like that, but these are my thoughts about them, and I hope you found them helpful. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I really, really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.